Pleased to join you once again, if virtually. As you mentioned, I was Executive Secretary of the National Security Council, and sometimes that title didn't translate all that well to foreign audiences. And I remember a couple of times I was asked whether or not I was responsible for the White House protective detail protecting the president. And I said, no, that's not exactly what we do. And I mean, at one point, he was permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Singapore. And that's the highest ranking position short of the foreign minister. And he was in China for a meeting with one of the vice premiers. And he was speaking in English. And of course, it was being interpreted at that point. And so he was being introduced to the vice premier. And he said that his position was permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And there was some hesitation as the Chinese interpreter was working this all out. And then she said something to the vice premier, and there were a few raised eyebrows around the world. Well, it turns out that she had identified him as the eternal typist in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the government of Singapore. At any rate, thanks very much for the introduction. I'm going to go through a presentation here on the sort of the history and the background of the National Security Council with some observations which are really personal in terms of how well it has been working in recent years. All of this flows from the National Security Act of 1947, which was signed by President Harry Truman in July of 1947. And this was following the World War II experience of the challenges of trying to coordinate defense, security policy, and diplomacy. At that time, of course, you had separate cabinet agencies, the Department of the Navy and the Department of War. And you also had a fledgling intelligence gathering operation under OSS. And there was a strong feeling right after the war that we needed more coordination of these different aspects of government and security policy. And the end result is you had the signing of the National Security Act of 1947. And what it provided for was something it called the National Military Establishment, which included the Army, Navy, and then the new Department of the Air Force. And it also called for the creation of a National Security Council, and this was to advise the president with respect to the integration of domestic, foreign, and military policies relating to national securities. And then it also created the Central Intelligence Agency. And just a few years later, in fact, 2 years later, 1949, there was a major amendment to the National Security Act of 47. And what it did is what it called the National Military Establishment then became what we know as the Department of Defense. And also the Central Intelligence Agency, which had been originally created as an office within the White House, was given sort of independent status plus a mandate to gather intelligence as necessary. This is sort of a wiring diagram of the National Security Council. It's pretty close to what is now being used in the Trump administration. You have statutory members, in other words, members by law, under the National Security Act of 1947, which include the president and vice president, the secretary of state, originally the director of CIA, but then later the director of national intelligence when that position was created, secretary of defense, and then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the National Security Advisor, position that was then later created in the Eisenhower administration. We now have a Homeland Security Advisor as well. Chief of Staff was often present. In this administration, for at least a few months or so, we had Steve Bannon. He insisted on being a member of the National Security Council, and he joined as the chief strategist, which was his title in this administration. And of course, as time went on, you had a lot of issues that really had economic dimensions or other or legal issues involved. And so the end result was that you had a number of other agencies that fairly quickly became part of the process, including the Office of the Attorney General, early on the Department of Treasury, and then later the Secretary of Energy and other agencies as well. And then you also had, whenever economic issues were a primary subject of discussion, you had agencies such as the U.S. Special Trade Representative, the Economic Advisor, a position that was also created, I think, early on in the Clinton administration, and then Department of Commerce and other agencies as necessary. But you do have, under the National Security Act of 47, the 4 statutory members, including in addition to the president, the vice president, and then all of the other offices that have been added as time went on. One point about the National Security Act of 1947 is that it created a certain amount of ambiguity over time in terms of actually who leads foreign policy. And there has been, of course, a certain amount of intertension. In some ways, some people think that that's probably a good idea. It helps facilitate the discussion and exchange of ideas across the way. But there have been obviously some personal rivalries. One of the famous ones, of course, was Henry Kissinger and William Rogers in the Nixon administration. And Henry Kissinger was far more visible than his counterpart, the Secretary of State. Secretary of State, of course, traditionally having been the primary spokesman and developer of foreign policy ideas. I remember also during the Carter administration, his national security advisor was Zbig Brzezinski, and his Secretary of State was Cyrus Vance. And there was certainly no love lost between the two. And again, it was almost a very interesting kind of a struggle back and forth as to who would take the lead on some of these issues. I was serving in the American Embassy in London at the time Carter was elected. Carter was a surprise nominee in the Democratic Convention. He was a surprise president when he was elected. And there was only one person in the American Embassy in London at that time, which is our 3rd largest embassy in the world. There was only one person who had actually met the incoming president before as governor of Georgia. So we were all anxious, of course, to find out more about what the Carter administration policies were. And the first public speech on defense and foreign policy that Carter made was actually at Annapolis. And at Annapolis, he made a speech which was largely focused on the Soviet Union, relations with the Soviet Union. And it was interesting because part of the speech was rather conciliatory, saying that we were looking for ways to try to discuss our differences and to develop a more productive relationship. The other part of the speech was very traditional. We're going to stand up to you. We're not going to give an inch. And of course, what you saw was a draft, the tough draft coming from Brzezinski and the National Security Council, and the more conciliatory draft coming from Cyrus Vance. And so the end result is that it was a document that really was a bit schizophrenic in terms of what it was really trying to say. But again, it sort of underscores the fact that the structure leaves a certain degree of ambiguity as to who really emerges as the primary spokesman on foreign and defense policy. The NSC system as it works, of course, includes the National Security Council. The National Security Council is sort of like the cabinet. It rarely meets because the Security Council itself is actually headed by the president. So it requires all of the principals to be there at one particular time. I remember one year when I was in the Clinton White House, we had a cabinet meeting, and it was really quite a big deal because it was the only cabinet meeting of the year. And it happened to be the day that they were taking their official portrait. So there's really no particular reason for them to meet other than to meet with a photographer. National Security Council does meet more often than the cabinet does, but most of the work, of course, is really done by the Principals Committee, or much of the work is done by the Principals Committee, which is chaired by the National Security Advisor with the heads of other agencies, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the head of the CIA, National Intelligence Director, and so on. The actual workhorse, if you call it that, of the NSC process is really the NSC Deputies Committee. And it meets fairly frequently, and it really formulates decisions to go up to the president. And then you also have what has been recently called policy coordination committees. This particular level has, the name has changed from time to time. PCCs are basically at the assistant secretary level. They're either headed or chaired by a senior director in the NSC, or they can be chaired by an assistant secretary in state or defense or equivalent rank in another agency, depending on what the subject is. And their responsibility is to try to flesh out decisions and basically put up recommendations for the deputies committee. And then once decisions are essentially reached and approved at the highest levels, then you have the issuance of something called the National Security Presidential Memoranda. Again, this terminology changes from time to time, but essentially it's a decision document to give guidance to the different agencies. Over the years, the National Security Council, I guess, has certainly expanded. President Truman had 12 members of his NSC in the White House. It was strictly in an advisory capacity. And for a number of years, the executive secretary of the NSC in the White House was considered to be the ranking member, the head of the NSC. And it was in the Eisenhower administration that you actually created the position of National Security Advisor. This is a photograph of Kennedy. This is in the cabinet room where this is taking place. Kennedy, McNamara, and Dean Rusk, and others to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here's another shot in the cabinet room. This is an NSC meeting taken in October 1964. This is to discuss the Gulf of Tonkin, where 2 American warships were reportedly fired upon by hostile North Vietnamese forces. This discussion eventually led to a congressional initiative and the so-called Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized the U.S. To expand its forces to begin basically the conflict in Vietnam. Secretary of Defense McNamara, President Johnson, Dean Rusk, in this particular shot in October '64. During Nixon's term, I mentioned the fact that Secretary of State William Rogers was sort of overshadowed by a young and eager-looking Henry Kissinger. Mel Laird, Secretary of State, of course, President, Vice President Spiro Agnew early on in Nixon administration. Here's a shot. This is taken downstairs in the office of the executive secretary is the so-called White House Situation Room. And here you have a meeting chaired by President Reagan. And the issue in this particular occasion was the hijacking of a TWA flight, which went all over the Middle East and involved all sorts of negotiations and the death, unfortunately, of some American passengers along the way. The president, it's kind of interesting to see this large portrait of Winston Churchill behind him. George Shultz, Secretary of State, Casey, CIA Director, also a young-looking George Bush, Vice President, and Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense. Start more of a discussion, I guess, about recent NSCs, starting with the Bush administration, the senior Bush administration, George H.W. Bush. And this is worth discussing in some detail because this is considered the gold standard in terms of how the NSC process is really supposed to work. And ultimately, it all depends on personalities and, of course, the backgrounds and experience of individuals, including the president. In this particular case, President Bush had spent 8 years as vice president, had a lot of foreign policy experience. He had also been director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And he was also the head of our unofficial liaison office in the People's Republic of China before normalization. So he had a lot of international experience. He also had the benefit of Brent Scowcroft, a lieutenant general in the Air Force, who was his national security advisor. Scowcroft actually believed in really trying to get the best ideas and putting them forward to his boss without necessarily being an advocate. James Baker was the Secretary of State, and Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense. And this particular trio worked effectively during that administration. And in fact, Scowcroft had a lunch, I think, every Thursday in the White House, and Baker and Cheney were always there and always checked in. And so it was a pretty harmonious team, and I think fairly successful. Of course, unfortunately for President George H.W. Bush, his successes in foreign policy were not matched by his domestic policy, and largely difficulties in the economy really made him sort of a one-term president. But here's a meeting of the NSC. This is in the White House Oval Office with the President, Vice President Quayle, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, Secretary of State James Baker. Here's Brent Scowcroft, the NSC advisor, and here's Colin Powell, at that time Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the discussion here is what to do about the occupation of Kuwait by the forces of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And in many ways, that particular campaign, of course, the eventual effort to dislodge Saddam from Kuwait, was considered to be sort of a textbook example of how you really conduct diplomacy for a mission like the one they undertook. They went to the UN, they got appropriate UN resolutions. They had a very, very extensive diplomatic effort to reach out and find allies. And so you had a genuine coalition joining the United States in pursuing the actions against Saddam Hussein. Bill Clinton, of course, came in largely on the basis of a domestic agenda, because the domestic policies, unfortunately, of the senior Bush administration did not match his success in foreign policy. Bill Clinton had been governor of Arkansas, but he did have some foreign policy background. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He had also surprised many of us, because on our first trip to Japan, turns out that he knew a lot about Japan because he'd been there at least 3 or 4 times, heading trade missions as governor of Arkansas. And the other thing about Clinton was that he was a very, very quick brief. He could be read into any complicated subject very, very quickly. He read voraciously, listened very, very carefully, and really digested material in a rather amazing way in terms of his ability to gather information and ultimately make a decision on that basis. His vice president, Al Gore, of course, had considerable foreign policy experience, certainly lots of political experience as a senator from Tennessee. Tony Lake was his national security advisor. Lake was basically an academic. He had served in the previous Jimmy Carter administration as the head of policy planning in the State Department. Not particularly close to the president, but had joined the campaign and had moved to Little Rock during the campaign. Warren Christopher had been Deputy Secretary of State in the Carter administration. And then Les Aspin had been brought in as Secretary of Defense. Basically, in this first term of Clinton, NSC sort of took the lead. I think in some ways Warren Christopher was sort of focused on Middle East issues. That was his primary interest at that particular point. One of the major, I think, events during the first Clinton term, of course, was the effort to try to get together the PLO and the Israelis for a signing ceremony, which took place in September of 1993, following the Oslo agreements. This photograph, of course, has been reproduced many, many times. We actually rehearsed the handshake because, at least in the Oval Office, we were not sure that Rabin and Arafat would actually shake hands. There was, of course, a lot of historical animosity about the PLO. I was actually the senior official to greet Arafat at the White House, because some of our more senior colleagues didn't like the fact that this leader of the Palestinians was being converted from a terrorist into a statesman. At any rate, we were concerned that the handshake would not take place, and the handshake did take place. And so Clinton did not have to encourage the two together, and of course the handshake became quite famous. That was followed up, of course, with the Declaration of Washington, which sought to negotiate a peace agreement between Jordan and Israel, and that actually was followed by a signing of a peace treaty between Jordan and Israel. And of course, the sad thing, as we know, is in many ways the peace process sort of went off tracks after the assassination of Rabin. This is sort of another example of why, while you want to be a domestic policy president, as Clinton was, sometimes events get in the way. This was in October of 1993. And this particular image is of the Moscow White House, which is actually their parliament building. It's actually being shelled by government forces. And this is also an image that you saw repetitively on CNN. And the problem was that CNN didn't really have any real information or background to go behind it. So there was a lot of uncertainty as to what all this meant, and particularly for a new president, Boris Yeltsin, whether or not it was a serious challenge to his authority. We were scheduled to go to Seattle, Washington, to Sacramento, California, on that day on a trip. And it was a trip designed to push healthcare and also meet with labor union types in San Francisco. And so there was some question as to whether or not we would actually cancel this meeting. So we actually took the trip out from Marine One to Andrews Air Force Base. This is normally a 14 to 15 minute flight. And the routine is that you could actually get in a number of rounds before the helicopter landed at Andrews Air Force Base. And the guy who always won, of course, was President Bill Clinton, because he was a card counter. On this particular occasion, we were even contemplating canceling the trip because of the seriousness of what was going on in Moscow as we were heading out to Andrews Air Force Base. And so this is our press secretary, Dee Dee Myers, and this is Bruce Lindsay, one of Clinton's advisors. Anyway, we went ahead, made the trip, but in the meantime, we also heard that a number of U.S. military personnel had been killed in Somalia. And this was later made famous as Black Hawk Down. So we had two crises going on at this time, and yet we were on our way to Sacramento to really push healthcare. Just before the live TV broadcast to talk about healthcare at a TV studio in Sacramento, I had briefing notes that I had just gotten from Tony Lake, and briefed the president while he was getting makeup put on. And Dee Dee Myers came in and said, I think we're off the hook because they've agreed that they're not going to talk about Russia, that they will focus on healthcare, as we all agreed. And so anyway, we thought we had a little bit of breathing space on that point. But on the other hand, as soon as the cameras started rolling, this TV station, a local TV station in Sacramento, could not resist the temptation to make national news and ask the president about what was happening in Moscow, and also to a certain extent what was happening in Somalia, but really Moscow at this particular point. And what amazed me was the fact that I wasn't quite convinced that Clinton was getting everything that I was briefing, because he was getting makeup at that particular time. He was very distracted, and we were running late, as we often were. At any rate, he spent the first 2 or 3 minutes basically covering every single point that I had in my brief. And in fact, I actually got my notes out to really refresh myself. Did I actually brief him on all these particular points? So from that point on, I never worried about the fact that you were often briefing on the run, or that he may not have fully understood what you were trying to say at that particular point. Anyway, to make a long story short, we also heard later on that night, we were in San Francisco later that night, more serious things happening in Somalia. And it was a good example. Of course, that was in the news the next day, but good example of the fact that, all of the best intentions to really sort of focus very, very hard, in this case, on domestic policy, on domestic healthcare policy, kind of went awry because the president also has foreign policy responsibilities. Here's an example of one of the meetings that took place downstairs in the Situation Room And the subject here was Bosnia in 1994. President, Secretary of State Warren Christopher, Tony Lake, National Security Advisor, Madeleine Albright, who had come down from New York, U.S. Representative of the United Nations, and this is General Shalikashvili, who was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In the second Clinton administration, Tony Lake had left, and Sandy Berger, who had been his deputy, became National Security Advisor. He was closer to Clinton, and they had a closer relationship. And then Madeleine Albright came down from New York to become Secretary of State. And both of these individuals were fairly strong personalities. And so for much of the second term, there was a certain amount of intertension between the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. And so a number of us later on, after administration, were quite amused by the fact that both of these individuals, Madeleine Albright and Sandy Berger, established consulting firms in Washington, D.C. Berger started something known as Stonebridge Associates. Madeleine Albright had her own name on her consulting company. And then lo and behold, after some months went by, the two merged. So you had these two individuals who were actually sort of rivals in many, many ways, competing for attention, actually joining in what is now called Albright-Stonebridge. The Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, this is a bit of a confusing picture. This is kind of an anomaly in contrast to the senior Bush's NSC. And that is because you had fairly strong personalities in the formulation of national security policy at the White House and at the cabinet level. And so Condi Rice actually had a very close relationship with George Bush, known him for many, many years, worked very hard on the campaign. But in many ways, she had a lower key role as National Security Advisor. And part of it is because you had a very, very assertive Vice President, Dick Cheney, and of course, a very experienced Secretary of Defense in Don Rumsfeld. And so to a certain extent, the Cheney-Rumsfeld axis was probably more important in formulating ideas and making the argument to the president than the traditional role of the National Security Advisor in getting advice. And so sometimes the individual sort of left out in this kind of formula was the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, who was still in many ways the most visible cabinet member. And certainly in many circles, of course, the most credible cabinet member. So it was a slightly different situation in terms of how the Bush NSC worked. On the other hand, the Bush NSC and the Bush administration for the first term particularly was totally focused essentially on the events following 9/11. And this was a meeting in the Situation Room. Colin Powell, Secretary of State, Bush, Dick Cheney, Condi Rice, National Security Advisor, Don Rumsfeld here, and the discussion here was really, to follow on to initial steps that have been taken. Steve Hadley, Deputy National Security Advisor, you may or may not know about this individual. This is Scooter Libby, and Scooter Libby was Dick Cheney's foreign policy advisor, and in the second term of the Bush administration, Condi Rice moved over to be Secretary of State. And you had kind of the workings of the NSC process a little bit more in the traditional vein of sort of the first Bush administration. Steve Hadley was a national security advisor more in the mold of Brent Scowcroft. And you had more of an effort, I think, to sort of coordinate the views of the different agencies. And Don Rumsfeld, of course, was eventually eased out. Part of it, of course, sort of the feeling that the aftermath of the Gulf War was not going in the direction that they wanted. You also had, as a result of 9/11, the creation of two new positions. Basically, you had the creation of a Department of Homeland Security. And even after some years, I think it's still an experiment in process in terms of pulling together different organizations and putting them into an single organization, Department of Homeland Security. And you had a new position, and that was the Director of National Intelligence. And the first Director of National Intelligence was John Negroponte, who had been a career Foreign Service officer, served at least in 3 different embassies, and was essentially appointed to try to coordinate the intelligence effort in the second Bush administration. When Obama came in, Obama had sort of minimal foreign policy experience, even though he had been educated in Hawaii, lived in Indonesia. He certainly had more of a wide world view than some, but he had a very experienced vice president, former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Joe Biden. He also made a couple of very interesting appointments, I think good appointments. One was his arch rival in the campaign, Hillary Clinton, became Secretary of State. And he asked Bob Gates, who had been Rumsfeld's replacement in the Bush administration as Secretary of Defense, to continue. Gates, I think, is one of the great public servants of the modern era. He had been director, he'd been Deputy National Security Advisor, had a lot of experience. And I think the continuity he brought into that portfolio was very, very helpful in the early part of the administration. As an NSC advisor, Obama turned to a Marine General, Jim Jones, and that probably was not a very successful appointment. So eventually Jones left, and he was replaced by Tom Donilon. And Tom Donilon sort of took the approach of many individuals in the past in terms of believing that he was more of a coordinator of policy options for the president. This is also in the White House Situation Room, and the subject here is Afghanistan. Jim Jones, first National Security Advisor here on the left, Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State. Susan Rice was then the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Some speculation that she is she's certainly in the running to be named Secretary of State in the Biden administration, but I think there's some real question marks as to whether or not she could get confirmed. Denny Blair at that point was Director of National Intelligence. Leon Panetta at the CIA on the left of him. Rahm Emanuel, Chief of Staff. Mike McMullen, Chairman, Joint Chief of Staff, and of course Joe Biden. And it was very interesting because Biden really spoke up at some of these meetings, and he differed with some of the policy decisions that had been taken along the way. But obviously, Obama, I think, was well served to have a particularly good group around to advise him. This is a fairly famous photograph. This is the hunt for Osama bin Laden, the successful hunt for Osama bin Laden. Group at the White House Situation. Bob Gates, Secretary of Defense, Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, the President, the Vice President, Mike McMullen, who Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. This young man you may see more of. That's Tony Blinken, who is probably in the lead to become the new National Security Advisor in the Biden administration. Just before this photo was released, they also caught at the very last minute that this particular image that they had here, it was highly classified. And so when they finally released this photograph, this image has been appropriately blurred. In the second term of the Obama administration, had some significant changes. Hillary Clinton left. John Kerry, also senator, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, came as Secretary of State. Susan Rice was made National Security Advisor, replacing Tom Donilon. In some ways, one of the experts, I think, on the NSC process is a writer by the name of David Rothkopf, and he actually served for a while in the NSC in the Clinton administration, but he's written a couple of books and a number of articles, and he has been sort of a critic of the NSC process in terms of analyzing how well or how poorly it functions in terms of doing what it's supposed to do, and that's providing policy options to the president. And it's very interesting because Rothkopf's assessment of the first Obama administration was very, very positive. Under Tom Donilon as the NSC advisor, Rothkopf had some fairly scathing things to say about how well or how poorly the NSC operated in the second Obama term. And part of his argument was that first he thought that the NSC expanded. In fact, at one point, they almost counted 400 people in the NSC staff. And then the first term of Clinton, at one point, we were required to go down to 149 positions. Those numbers, of course, expanded fairly well afterwards, but nothing in terms of 400 or so National Security Council staff in the second Obama term. And then the other argument was that basically policymaking had essentially gravitated to the NSC, and that cabinet agencies had less and less of a role. But it's very interesting to sort of compare Rothkopf's analysis, the differences between Obama 1 and Obama 2 in terms of their approach. White House Situation Room is kind of interesting because this was taken. This is a photograph of it as it was refurbished under George W. Bush's administration. And this was done for the anniversary of the White House, the Situation Room. Situation Room was actually established by John Kennedy, who sort of felt after the Bay of Pigs that you needed to have more of a kind of a centralized operation to try to not only manage operations overseas, but also to gather information and data. So you had the beginning of a real 24-hour watch and a refurbished Situation Room. And so this was the Situation Room as it looked on the anniversary occasion, and with a lot of the electronic technology that you have now. Trump administration, you almost have to go year by year simply because the characters change so frequently. You may or may not remember Michael Flynn, the National Security Advisor, who lasted less than a month. He was the first National Security Advisor, so he was quickly replaced by H.R. McMaster. And McMaster was actually an Army general who came in to take that particular position. First Secretary of State was Rex Tillerson, a former oil company executive. Then you also had, I think, a very credible appointment as Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis. And you also had the coordinator for National Director for National Intelligence. This was Dan Coats, who was a former senator from Indiana, former ambassador to Greece, fairly credible conservative Republican, and someone who I think did a fairly good job and was eventually replaced and has been increasingly critical of the Trump administration and its policy making. One of the first things Trump did was to take the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He had promised this during the campaign. I personally think that that was one of the big mistakes that we have made as a nation. I hope that the new administration will reconsider some association with the TPP process. But Trump, to his credit, lived up to some of his campaign promises, and this was one of them, to get rid of our involvement in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is an early phone call. This is a phone call with Vladimir Putin. It's interesting. My apologies for the background noise. It's interesting that this most of the people in the photograph were gone pretty soon. Reince Priebus, who is chief of staff, Steve Bannon, the political advisor, the chief strategist, the press secretary, Sean Spicer, and the first National Security Advisor, Mike Flynn. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about this photograph is there's no NSC staff person in the room. And that was almost tradition in the past, that the expert on the country that's involved was usually in the room to be able to brief the president immediately before the phone call and even answer questions that might come up during the call. H.R. McMaster, as I said, had been brought in to replace Flynn after Flynn obviously had gotten into some difficulty for misstatements that he had made in terms of his activities before the campaign. And McMaster, of course, is one of those who's also left the White House and has had some criticism of how the president has operated. The president, of course, made a lot of his focus was on personal diplomacy, and he reached out to Xi Jinping, for example, early on. This is before he decided to use the heavy leverage of tariff policy to try to improve the trade deficit with China. And this was an early meeting down at Mar-a-Lago. Again, the president sort of living up to some of his campaign promises. He announced early on his intention to take us out of the Paris Accords, and that he did with the White House announcement in the summer of 2017. As I say, you have to sort of follow the Trump administration almost year by year, simply because of the changes that were involved. H.R. McMaster, president did not particularly like his style, his briefing style, among other things. And he was replaced by John Bolton. Bolton, a well-known conservative in Republican circles, had been U.S. representative to the United Nations in the George W. Bush administration. Bolton, a very controversial figure, and in fact, he was a recess appointment during the Bush administration. In other words, because he could not get confirmed in his own right. But Bolton had a lot of foreign policy experience and had a number of very strong ideas in terms of what needed to be done. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State at the beginning, obviously had his differences with the president as well, and he was replaced by Mike Pompeo, who had been former congressman from Kansas, who then had headed up the CIA early on. Jim Mattis continued in the second year of the administration as Secretary of Defense, and Dan Coats had continued in his position as Director of National Intelligence. Trump really moved more forcefully, I think, in terms of trying to live up to some of his campaign promises in terms of really using heavy instruments to try to change the behavior of some of our trading partners. And so he announced early on in 2018 tariffs, particularly on steel and aluminum imports. And the justification for this was actually on national security grounds. And I think for many of us, we were sort of scratching our head and sort of figuring out exactly what is the national security threat of Canadian industry, because Canada was actually one of the countries that was subject to these tariffs. Obviously, the main emphasis was to try to protect the domestic industry and maintain his support among those who had voted for him in the Rust Belt areas. And then he moved increasingly aggressively in terms of using tariffs on trying to reduce trade deficit with the Chinese. We had a series of tariffs on Chinese goods that sort of came in cycles. And in my mind, I think it was unfortunate because I think tariffs are kind of a blunt instrument and they really can be used two ways. I think the idea was that you would impose these tariffs on China and somehow the Chinese would pay for the increased costs of goods. But in actual fact, it's in many ways the American consumer that has done that. But I think the other thing that I think we've missed here is the fact that other countries had very similar complaints about dealing with the Chinese, and certainly the Europeans, Japanese, Koreans, and others. And I think it was a tremendously missed opportunity not to work with other countries in concert to try to do something about fairly aggressive Chinese economic practices. But at any rate, for much of the Trump administration, you've seen a fairly tense relationship. People call it a trade war with China. And we are in a situation where a large number of Chinese goods are subject to tariffs that have been imposed by the Trump administration. The Chinese have committed to buy a large number of American goods by the end of this year. I think we're going to be far short of that particular goal, largely because of COVID and many other reasons. But for the time being, it's one of those problems that's going to be kicked forward to the next administration. Another campaign concern that Trump had talked about and pledged to do something about, he said that the Iran nuclear agreement was one of the worst ever negotiated in the history of our republic. And so another thing that he did early on was to withdraw from the agreement, the international agreement on sanctions on Iran. One of the, again, another manifestation of the notion of personalized diplomacy was to do something about the Korea problem. And to a certain extent, the tensions in between the United States and North Korea really came to a head in 2017, the first year of the administration, when there was a real exchange of fairly provocative rhetoric. Trump called Kim Little Rocket Man. Kim called Trump a dotard. Not entirely sure what that is, but at any rate, there was quite an exchange of fairly nasty rhetoric back and forth, and there was actually talk about possible conflict. So Trump had decided that he was going to take care of this public with sort of personal diplomacy, and so you had the first meeting, very, very widely covered internationally, between Kim Jong-un and President Trump, taking place in Singapore in 2018. And I think, even people who were skeptics like myself at that particular time thought, well, this is interesting. This might actually work. But we found out that it hasn't really resulted in dramatic improvements. In the third year of the Trump administration, you had yet again some changes. You had yet again a national security advisor, in this particular case, Robert O'Brien, an individual that I think people said that Trump finally got the national security advisor he wants, in the sense that he tends to sort of agree with many of Trump's initiatives and hasn't really staked out a very high profile for himself, as in the case of John Bolton. Mike Pompeo, as Secretary of State, continued closer relationship, I think, with the president, and more relied upon by the president for foreign policy issues. And Mattis being replaced by Mark Esper, former Boeing executive, as Secretary of Defense. And of course, Esper recently fired. But again, a number of changes in the lineup. You had a second important meeting. There have actually been 3 face-to-face meetings between Kim and Trump. The last was largely a photo opportunity, but this second one was supposed to be substantive as well. You see John Bolton at the table. Bolton is probably biting his lip because he didn't want any part of this. He actually thought that the effort to try to engage Kim Jong-un was going to be unsuccessful, and basically gave Kim international stature, and we didn't get anything for it. That was sort of Bolton's view along the way. So at any rate, another meeting, lots of attention, lots of international attention, but only temporarily sort of calmed the waters a bit. Trump administration also took a number of steps in the Middle East. Netanyahu, of course, has made it no secret that he preferred Trump as a candidate for presidency. In fact, he came to the United States during the campaign. And I think his views were reciprocated. You had the appointment of David Friedman, as who you see here. He's the U.S. ambassador to Israel, very, very pro-Israeli. And so you had a number of steps taken, including the decision to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And in this particular case, the United States recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. U.S. relations with NATO, of course, fairly early on, Trump signaled his dissatisfaction with our NATO partners for not spending more on their own defense, and developing not particularly productive relations with some of the NATO principals, and particularly, unfortunately, with Angela Merkel. And in fact, in the earlier part of this year, there was an effort to basically have a G7 meeting back in Washington. It's supposed to be in Camp David. Merkel basically said, no, it's impossible to do that. And to a certain extent, I think that it was fairly clear that Merkel was also demonstrating her impatience and unhappiness with not only some of the actions, but also some of the verbiage that was coming from the Trump administration in terms of really his criticism of the European experiment and NATO itself. Finally, this year, you continue to have, of course, Robert O'Brien, again, the national security advisor that the president wanted. You did have Esper, of course, just fired within recent weeks. You also had a new director of national intelligence, and this is John Ratliff, former congressman from Texas, who many people have said is the least prepared intelligence leader in our history. But on the other hand, of course, again, someone that was close to the president and the president liked for that particular job. And of course, this year we have been facing, of course, the horrible prospect of dealing with the global pandemic. And in this particular instance, the president made it very, very clear that he was unhappy with not only the behavior of China, but also the behavior of the WHO, and announced his decision to withdraw from the WHO itself. So that was a quick tour of some of these issues. I want to just conclude with a few maybe summary comments. One is that the NSC over time, since 1947, has been really the structure used by most presidents to kind of exercise executive power in foreign defense policy. And the Act of 1947 still provides the basic framework for shaping our foreign and defense policy. I think it's an open question as to whether or not we really probably need a new statutory basis for determining what the NSC does, its composition. We're talking about a number of new issues now across economic lines, public health issues, counterterrorism. A lot of these issues have now come to the fore, and it may be time for us to really think, as in a case, a couple times the Department of Defense and defense establishment has faced reforms, and it may be time for a new legislative basis for creating the National Security Council. As I mentioned, of course, the Scowcroft model is probably the gold standard in terms of a national security advisor who's really committed to looking at all of the options and presenting them to the president. I think ultimately this is a conclusion that we draw, is that the success of any administration really depends on people and not on organizational charts, and depends on the kind of people that you have in these positions. And then finally, I would conclude by saying the president gets the executive branch and the National Security Council that he really wants. Very quickly, just a few challenges facing the new administration, facing the United States: recovery from the post-COVID, actually recovery from COVID, and then the recovery of the economy. Because I've always said that you can't be as assertive and as influential in international affairs if you don't have your own house in order, and we certainly need to do that. Perceptions of the United States overseas, that is very troubling as well, because our notion as the nation on the hill, a lot of countries sort of take exception to that traditional view of U.S. leadership. And the role of the U.S. in the global economy, what our trade policy is going to be in the future, global security threats, including cybersecurity. In Asia, obviously China, other issues as well. In Europe, NATO, our relationships with the EU, the Middle East, Iran, Afghanistan, the aftermath in Syria, refugees, lots of issues like that. Latin America, our dealings with Mexico, problems in Venezuela. Trump at one point talked about maybe invading Venezuela. So that's another issue that's probably off the headlines right at the moment, but an issue facing new administration, nuclear non-proliferation beyond just North Korea and Iran. And then all of these other issues, these transnational issues that have taken up much, much more of our time now and our focus on international affairs, climate change, health issues, future pandemics, terrorism, refugees, that sort of thing. Finally, on just COVID, just some comparisons. For example, in statistical comparisons, China with 1.4 billion people, United States with 328 million people, and we have over 11.3 million cases and 247,000 plus people who have died of the pandemic since that particular time. And as you can also see, the economic impact. China is probably going to grow at 1% this year. The United States is going to see a contraction of almost 5%. I also been sort of comparing Thailand and New Mexico. Thailand, because I still have an interest in what's going on. Thailand was where they first had the first case outside of China of COVID-19. And they've done a very good job of dealing with it. Country of 70 million people, 3,878 cases, 60 deaths. Here you see classical dancers with protective gear. New Mexico, 2 million people, 67,559 cases and 1,264 deaths. So the problem is still with us, and it's going to take some time to recover. Finally, just to conclude here, I mentioned David Rothkopf. Here are a couple of his books listed here, along with a couple of other books if you have a particular interest in the NSC, the history of the NSC, and Rothkopf's assessment of the NSC. Also, this I put up the Pew link. This is Pew Charitable Trust, and this is something I look at from time to time, and it's perceptions of the United States overseas, and it's very sobering to me. I mean, particularly for someone that's spent many, many years in trying to explain the United States to foreign audiences. It's very sobering to sort of see how our stature has dropped rather dramatically. And so with that, thanks very much, Pat, and I hope we have time for a few questions.